Welcome to this episode of Uncle Connell's Queer History Corner and Coffee Clatch. Today's topic in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is Jarahal, the first black drag queen to perform on Utah stages in 1921. Jarahal was born Joseph Cook Hall in Fort Gaines, Georgia in 1892, the son of former slaves William and Sarah Hall. By 1915, Joseph had moved to West 99th Street in New York City to participate in the Harlem Renaissance and become a jazz musician and singer. 2 years later, he enlisted in the 367th Infantry for World War I. He was an excellent soldier, and his company shipped off to Europe in 1918, where he was quickly promoted to sergeant. And later that year, they participated in the Meuse-Argonne offensive on the Western Front, the largest and second most deadly battle in U.S. history. While serving valiantly in the military, he fell in love with France, where racial attitudes were far more welcoming than he had ever experienced in America. Just 3 months after being discharged and returning to America, he then went back to France as a civilian. This is his passport photo from 1921. He was returning to France as a jazz musician with the New York Syncopated Orchestra as they toured France. 2 years later, still in France, he requested a renewal of his passport so he could travel to other European countries for his profession, traveling with a jazz band. By now he had assumed the stage name of Jarahal Hall, or just Jarahal, and developed what was called a two-tone voice, meaning he could sing both baritone and soprano with ease. In 1925, he even befriended Langston Hughes, who was also living and thriving in Paris at the time. Jarahal had become such a well-known musician and singer in Paris that on October 16, 1926, he opened his own swanky jazz club at 41 Rue Pigalle called Jarahal's Nest. An article in a Parisian paper reports that the famous chanteuse Josephine Baker actually performed there on opening night, and a photo taken that night shows her standing next to a seated Jarahal in the club with other women. An article in the New Yorker published soon after the grand opening reported, "A Harlem club has opened in the Cité Pigalle, where it flourishes as Jarahal's Nest. The band is fine, the ceiling handsome, and Joe Hall, proprietor, sings and dances the Black Bottom, which he taught to the Prince of Wales at a tea last week. The Nest is the new chic resort after 2 o'clock. Josephine Baker breakfasts there. Joe serves pancakes and eggs." The flame of Jarahal's Nest burned hot but briefly, and it closed within a year. Without his own club, Jarahal made ends meet by performing at other jazz clubs in Paris until in 1927, the vaudeville troupe owned by Cunningham and Bennett saw him perform in a cabaret one evening. Jarahal, now occasionally singing in drag, was convinced by the two to return with them to America to tour with them, performing a drag number in their vaudeville show. Now, July 24th is the date that Utah celebrates annually as Pioneer Day, commemorating when the Mormons first entered the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, and on Pioneer Day 1928, the vaudeville troupe of Cunningham and Bennett arrived in Salt Lake and performed at the super swanky Pantages Theater at 148 South Main Street. The ad in the paper unfortunately misspelled Jarahal's name as Jarshal, and he performed that night in drag, singing with piano accompaniment by Paul Wincock. The Mormon-owned Deseret News reported him as a colored female impersonator who has a clear contralto voice that one could expect only in grand opera. This is the only photo of Jarahal in drag that I've been able to find, and it dates to 1930. Once his contract with Cunningham and Bennett ended, Jarahal returned to Harlem and continued singing professionally there, usually live, but sometimes for radio programs. He returned briefly to Paris in 1930, and then went back to Harlem, where in November 1930 he opened a cafe where he sang nightly in drag. Soon Jarahal opened his own studio in Harlem, teaching voice to students, but he also continued to perform in drag throughout the 30s. In 1941, he was commissioned to provide choral music for a vast and historically important vinyl album series called The Cavalcade of the American Negro. These recordings recounted African American history beginning in 1619, when the first African slaves were forced to come to the Atlantic shore. The Jarahal Choral Glee Club provided key musical pieces to back up the narration. By the mid-1940s, Jarahal opened the Jarahal School of Music on West 118th Street, where he and staff gave vocal lessons. On his faculty was the famous male impersonator Lillian Brown. Students included Lena Horne, Ruth Mason, Babe Wallace, and members of the group The Blenders. In the late 50s, he became friends with boxer Sugar Ray Robinson and ended up teaching Sugar Ray how to sing opera, and they remained close friends for many years. He is also known to have composed at least 3 songs covered by others during the 50s. I can find no record of what happened to Jarahal between 1960 and his death in 1976. For all of the influence he seems to have had, he is not found in African American histories, except as a minor footnote in Langston Hughes's autobiography. Jarahal is buried in the Long Island National Cemetery in East Farmingdale, New York. His grave marker using the name of Joseph C. Hall and listing his military service. Nothing else marks what a fabulously bright star he was in our world.